Welcome, everyone. I am Mireya Solis, Director of the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much for joining us for today's virtual event for Andrew Yeo's book, State, Society, and Markets in North Korea. Andrew will be discussing his excellent new book, which focuses on domestic and economic changes and shifts in state-society relations in North Korea. Several important developments have taken place under the rule of Kim Jong Un. Markets have grown, a new middle class has emerged, and the country has experienced modest levels of urban development. Andrew's new book evaluates how much change is actually taking place, and more importantly, what are the likely implications for the evolution of relations between markets, state, and society. He poses a really fundamental question. Can these emerging markets weaken state control and undermine the regime's legitimacy, or will they be co-opted by the state, furthering top-down control of the economy and society? Andrew will be joined in conversation by Jean Lee, Global Fellow at the Wilson Center and veteran journalist in North Korea, and Sheena Greitens, non-resident senior fellow at Brookings and associate professor at UT Austin. Sheena, over to you to join and moderate this discussion.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Maria. And thank you very much for organizing this discussion. It's really a pleasure to be here today to talk about Andrew's book on state, society, and market in North Korea, which tackles this really fundamental question of how North Korean society relates to the state and vice versa in the context of the market developments that you've described. Andrew, I wanted to ask you two questions to start our discussion, and I'll take them one at a time. The first question is just, tell us a little bit about what drew you to this project and what made you decide that this was a development that you needed to write a book about.
Thanks, Sheena. And before I answer that, I just wanted to say how delighted I am to share this virtual stage with two distinguished experts who can offer lucid insights into North Korea and authoritarian politics. And I also wanted to thank Brookings Center for East Asia Policy Studies and our staff, especially Adrian Chuen, for setting up this webinar around my new book. So to answer your question, Sheena, about what drew me to the project, as a Korean American interested in Korea-related affairs, I've been following North Korean politics since my time as an undergraduate. That dates me now to the late 1990s. And back then, scenarios for North Korea's future boiled down to either regime collapse, regime absorption, or muddling through. Now, North Korea has clearly muddled through, but other significant developments, including the rise of markets, the expansion of nuclear weapons, and new leadership have emerged in the past 2.5 decades. So this book was a way to organize my own thinking about the prospects for domestic change in North Korea.
That's great. That's really helpful. Obviously, there's been a lot going on the Korean Peninsula and in North Korea in terms of the economy, but also in terms of security and the growth of the nuclear program, which is what North Korea is often in the news for, and sometimes can overshadow or at least distract attention from some of the big domestic transformation and evolution that's occurred inside the DPRK. So tell us a little bit about the core arguments of the book. I want to give you a few minutes in particular just to introduce, the content of the book, the main arguments you make, and what it is that you want all of us to know about the developments that you trace in the book.
Sure, I'd be happy to do so. So, I will spend a few minutes here. The book is a fairly short book. I think it's under 100 pages, but the short book I wrote is ultimately about how we understand domestic change in North Korea. On one hand, there seems to be little change. The Kim family dynasty has outlived almost every current dictatorship in its 70+ years of continuous rule. North Korea, it still remains one of the poorest countries in the world, and perennially ranks near the bottom of any index measuring human freedom. And even the conversations we have about North Korea sometimes seem static. Will North Korea give up its nuclear weapons, or is the regime capable of economic reforms? is there a food crisis? Or, oh my God, we haven't even seen Kim Jong Un for 3 weeks. Is he alive? So these are the sort of questions that make it seem like North Korea isn't really changing. But on the other hand, for the past decade, we've been entertained by accounts of rising markets, the emergence of a nouveau riche, and the existence of a post-famine generation, or the Jangmadang generation, who crave for more information about the outside world. So both narratives may actually be true, and the question of change may depend on what aspect of North Korea or which region of the country one is examining. So from a macro level perspective, it may appear that little has changed about North Korea. But I might say at a micro level, there is widespread consensus among North Korea experts about the significant role markets play in North Korea's economy and their importance to state and private actors. Formal and informal markets have become a permanent fixture now in what is supposed to be a socialist state. I think what's up for debate, though, is whether and to what degree markets and trade networks have altered state-society relations in North Korea. So that's really the focus of the book. I talk a lot about markets, but how have markets changed that relationship between state and society? And central here is whether expanding markets weaken authoritarian rule. Key to my argument is the question of authoritarian legitimacy. So this concept of legitimacy becomes an important concept in the book. And I want to see how well Kim Jong Un manages to successfully co-opt markets into the regime's ideology. And the key argument here is that if the regime implements controlled economic measures, extracts rents, and subsumes the market economy into its ideology, the state will likely retain strong authoritarian control. So markets will become beholden to the state, giving the regime a much needed revenue and thereby empowering rather than weakening the state. So in this hypothesis, if Kim Jong Un is able to incorporate markets into his ideology, then the state, we're going to see the state, we're going to see more continuity. The state's going to be able to maintain control over society. But in contrast, if the regime is unable to incorporate markets into its legitimating messages, as private actors build informal trust networks, share information, or collude with state bureaucrats, more fundamental changes in state-society relations, I think, will be in order. As North Koreans become more dependent on markets for economic survival, the regime's authoritarian grip may weaken as gaps emerge between the regime's ideology, so what Kim Jong Un has been telling the population, and then the actual experiences of North Koreans. In that sense, markets may continue to shift power in favor towards private market participants, and at the same time, it may hollow out the legitimacy of the state. And if that's the case, we may begin to see signs of what I call a public sphere, an emerging public sphere. And many say that that's the precursor to a civil society. Now, I'll just end here by stating that there is much greater optimism about markets empowering society in the mid-2010s when money was flowing and donjus, the new capitalists, were thriving in a pre-pandemic, pre-heavily sanctioned North Korea. And this, of course, was when I had all these questions about whether change was taking place in the country. Now, North Korea watchers, myself included, have become less sanguine about about societal, much less political change today. And this stems from almost 2 years of heavy border lockdowns, and of course the sanctions. But we have also seen the regime crack down on the spread of capitalist and outside cultural influence. There also seems to be a tightening of ideological indoctrination. Kim Jong Un has levied heavy fines or imprisoned corrupt officials and donjus, and the regime has ordered new directives to centralize economic authority from earlier this year. So while the regime, what the regime is doing right now, I'd say it's regulating rather than co-opting market forces, and so it's right now it seems like there's really not much change at all. But after the pandemic ends, or if sanctions are eased and money begins to flow again, market forces may once again prevail. And the regime, we do see it periodically tighten and then loosening restrictions on markets. I don't have a crystal ball that can predict what's going to happen, but again, I think a lot of it has to do with how the state adopts or incorporates markets into its own regime ideology. And depending on how well it does that or how well it doesn't do that, state-society relations is going to change in different directions. So I'll stop right there, and I don't know, maybe others may have comments.
Great. Well, we've got a couple of different questions already from the audience that I can put to you as follow-ups. But before we do that, I wanted to turn to Jean Lee and ask her, for her thoughts and reflections on the book that Andrew has offered to us and on what he's just said. You have a really unique, previous on-the-ground perspective inside North Korea. So I wanted to ask you, what from the book resonated and what questions does this book bring up for you? Over to you.
Thank you, Sheena. I already have so many questions for Andrew, but first of all, I want to thank you and Brookings for inviting me to take part in this discussion, because it gave me this chance to get a sneak peek at Andrew's book. And congratulations, Andrew, on producing, I think it was a very insightful piece of work, especially at a time when we've had so little access to reliable information about North Korea. It's been such a challenging time. So we'll certainly hope to hear from you about that challenge. I think being cut off from North Korea the way that we have for the past few years, and the relative quiet since the breakdown of diplomatic talks, means that we've seen less investigation about North Korea in the news. But I don't think that means that we should take our eyes off the prize when it comes to this goal of trying to define what's happening inside North Korea. So I really commend you for refusing to shy away from this topic at a time when it's been so difficult to get information. And I think, the question that you pose in your abstract, and I'm just going to read it, to what extent is North Korean politics and society changing, is such an interesting one. It's a perennial question that deserves examination at every moment, with every development. And I have to say, as a journalist, so, I will explain that as a journalist, of course, as a foreign correspondent, you first arrive in Asia, and the challenge is, how do you cover North Korea? How do you get into North Korea? And first you cover it from the outside. But then for me, and that will mean covering the developments that we get based on their provocations, based on what we see in their state media. And then when you get on the ground, and I was lucky enough to be able to work from North Korea over the course of about 10 years, you start to ask the very question that you're looking at is, to what extent is there change? How is the economy evolving? What kind of social change is there? As journalists, we try to capture the trends, economic development, the political and social change of any country. It's certainly not easy with North Korea, but then when you get there, you see that things are a little bit different on the ground than the way it's portrayed in their state media. And immediately you realize, okay, I've got to try to figure out how to get past the propaganda so that I can understand what's really happening at the ground level. It's not easy from the outside. It's certainly not easy either from the inside, but that access has certainly shaped my understanding of North Korea. Andrew, one of the questions you asked me this was actually years ago, is there any civil society in North Korea? And I don't know if you remember this, but I was completely stumped by the question. And I think I said to you, I don't know how to answer that question, and let me get back to you. So this is our opportunity to ask that question. And I think with the book, you use that question as the basis for trying to understand change so effectively. For me as a journalist, it was so rewarding to have the richness of the research that you present as you formulate this narrative structure, this question of, is there civil society? I think it's a hard question for me to have grappled with, because it seems like a concept that is very much a part of our democratic societies, but completely difficult to apply to North Korea. But on the other hand, I kept thinking, when you asked me that question years ago, And yet I see so much activity and social organization on the ground in North Korea. And the way that, since you asked me that question in the past, and actually after having read your book, I would say that it's such a different construct. It's about survival in a sense. It's a very different type of civil society in the sense that it's not perhaps about the same definition of non-governmental organization. Obviously, in North Korea, I think that so much of the society is built around the political structure, the party, but there is so much social structure or social gathering that comes out of the need for survival. And it's not necessarily something that we can see in their state media. It's not necessarily something that we can see from the outside, but you certainly feel it on the ground. You see how people gather out of the need for survival, whether it's economic survival, political survival, or just to make it through the day at their workplace, within the party. And I wonder, I'd be curious to discuss with you whether that constitutes civil society. And perhaps it doesn't mean direct opposition to the government, but it's more about how people get by and survive in a society that is so repressive, restrictive, in a culture where conformism is a predominant emphasis, and where people just want to make sure that they fit into whatever the mainstream is in their community. I think it's important to recognize too that we're reaching the 10-year mark of Kim Jong Un's rule. And I have seen over the past 10 years such a change on the ground, and yet so little change. And I think this is a frame that both you and Sheena have alluded to. With the growth of the markets, absolutely. Are we seeing this as ownership that the people are taking of their livelihoods? Or are we seeing it as the state being unable to provide for their people and people having to fend for themselves? I think it's both. With the growth of the middle class, is this ownership of their own livelihoods again, and a sense of power that they are embracing? And what kind of challenge does that pose for Kim Jong Un as he tries to continue to cultivate the loyalty of that middle class at a time when he's being cut off from all of those goods and luxury items that the Kims had been using for many decades to keep that loyalty in place? And I think I certainly have seen on the ground things shift and change. So I think it's important to remember that there's no monolithic policy, that these things are constantly fluctuating. You see a lot of foreign products in North Korea because I do think that Kim Jong Un did want to expose his people and turn them into a more sophisticated, I would say the elites, a more sophisticated population, sent them overseas because he did realize that he needed to bring in information from the outside, but then had to rein that in because there is that moment where that exposure to the outside world also means a loss of control. So trying to understand where the sweet spot is something a challenge that he faces and I think continues to face. Andrew, one question I would have for you, I think, is how do we build in understanding of the border closures, not just as a result of the threat of the pandemic, but also as a way to regain control over some of not only the exposure to outside goods and outside ideas that the marketplace offers with people crossing the border. I think that's something that you do discuss this in the book, and you do discuss the threat of the access to information and the role that marketplaces play in providing a space for exposure to the outside world. So I hope that you'll discuss that a bit more. And I think that if there's anything I can share about what it's like on the ground, it is that there is this fog of propaganda that the state tries to present, this picture of unity and solidarity. But of course, on the ground, North Koreans, while they may seem so robotic to us in the pictures that are portrayed and the propaganda that's portrayed in the military parades, they are just as opinionated about their political system, about their leader, about their lives, have just as many complicated feelings about their situation, about the outside world. They are just better at putting on a presentation, putting on a face for their survival. And the challenge for us is to be able to get past that, to really understand what they're thinking, how they're motivated, and then eventually how that can bring about change, which Andrew, I think you discussed very well in your book. And so I will leave it at that. I actually have a million questions, but I am going to let Sheena take over the discussion and perhaps introduce some of the questions that we've gotten from the audience.
Well, Andrew, I'm going to give you a chance to respond briefly, if you'd like, to any of Jean's comments and questions. And then I have a few questions lined up that we've gotten from our audience.
Sure. Thanks, Sheena. And thank you so much, Jean, for those comments and for your insights. And I will get to the question about the border lockdown, but let me start by saying I'm so glad you remembered that conversation we had about civil society. It was at the Somerset in Seoul, the German restaurant that's at the lower level. And I do remember asking you because everyone said, oh, Jean Lee, she was the first first correspondent for AP in Pyongyang, and so here's someone that would have firsthand accounts. And I remember your response then as well too, because first of all, civil society is not in North Korea is not going to look like civil society as we see it in the West or in the United States. But you did talk about, how people, they, in order to survive, they do talk with one another. They, they have friendships, they can associate, but there's always a sense of, a little bit of distrust as well too. And that was really the question that motivated this book about whether there is a civil society or not in North Korea. Now, on one hand, you could say, no, there isn't. And I have a short book, but some people have said that that's going to be a very, very short book. You can't write a book about North Korean civil society. It doesn't even exist. But on the other hand, there are these signs where North Koreans do gather, they get together, and because of markets, you do have these gatherings that are especially informal markets that are outside of the state. And so things like informal trust networks that grow, social capital. These are all the precursors to, or what I've called with some of my other co-authors, building blocks to civil society. So while there isn't a civil society proper as we know it here in the West, it doesn't mean that the trappings of civil society aren't in the making in North Korea. So that's what I wanted to discuss in the book. Some of the editors, and they may be listening here now, they actually encouraged me to move away from the direction of civil society because it was almost speculative, and to instead go focus more on this academic question of state-society relations. And so that's what we have. But at the heart of it, I had the same question as Eugene, and it goes back to my initial question to you of whether there is or whether there can be a civil society emerging in North Korea. And to answer very briefly, part of it depends on what your definition of civil society is. In the book, in the first chapter, it goes through a brief discussion of different concepts. And if your idea of civil society is voluntary associations or associational life that exists independent of the state, then no, that doesn't exist in North Korea. But I latch on to this idea of civil society based on a public sphere, and I used that word earlier in my remarks. And it's this idea that people are able to have discussions or talk or to debate outside the confines of the state. Now that doesn't exist. That may not exist as well either in North Korea because of the surveillance state, because of North Koreans being monitored at all times. But it doesn't mean that there are moments where North Koreans do have different thoughts or they're thinking. It's double speak, whereas officially you may be saying one thing about the regime, or you may be officially praising the regime, but in private you may have different thoughts, and that's something that markets may generate. You participate in markets, especially informal markets, because you can't rely on the state anymore. So these are all actions or behaviors that might suggest that there is some semblance of civil society that's there. Now, to the question about the border pandemic, I agree with you, Gene. I do think that Kim Jong Un has used this as a rationale to really rein in markets, or to try to bring markets back under the state control. And I'm with you as well too. In 2016 seemed to be the peak of market activity and This was again before heavy sanctions, but I got the sense that Kim Jong Un really wanted to transform North Korea. They talked about the Pyeongjin line, the parallel track between developing the economy, but also the nuclear program. But there was a considerable emphasis or a shift towards growing the economy following Kim Jong Il, and we did see that, and it required North Koreans to go abroad. But at some point, he must have felt insecure, or things may have gotten out of control, and you can't rein it in. There would be these attempts to try to rein it in, but they wouldn't really work. You would have to open things back up again. But now, because of the pandemic, you have the perfect excuse to lock everything down. And so I'm with you there, Jean, in that I do think that that's been used as a rationale to really take back control of what the donjus, the capitalists, the nouveau riche, the middle class have been able to build. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens once the lockdowns begin to ease. But yes, that's a very excellent insight there.
Well, in that sort of use or finding political utility in the pandemic, North Korea is not alone. Some colleagues of mine in political science have a forthcoming piece at International Security that talks about opportunistic repression as one of the consequences of the pandemic, in that it gave authorities or aspiring leaders with autocratic tendencies or repressive tendencies a pretext or an opportunity with a sort of public interest justification to engage in repression that had a regime strengthening sort of effect and a really repressive effect on society. So North Korea may be one end of that spectrum, and it probably is, but it's part of a broader global trend, which I think is a really interesting point. So Andrew, you've already touched on one of the questions that I was going to ask you, which has to do with the effect of the pandemic, both on border security, but also on internal control of movement, which we know is pretty essential, even at the local level, to sustaining market activity. So I think we've kind of covered that question, but I wanted to ask you a question that is about the pandemic, but also simply about how you go about researching and writing a book like this when North Korea is especially closed, right? North Korea is always a difficult country to try to get access to. Jean's remarks, I thought, really illustrated that challenge. And so for our audience who's listening today, I think it just give us a little bit of insight into the mechanics and the sources that you draw on, and how you went about trying to write a book like this and get answers to these questions when North Korea is unusually closed for an extremely closed country, right? You've got a closed country that then is at an even more restricted or internally directed time than usual. So how did that affect the book writing, and how do you try to circumvent that challenge?
Sure. Well, there's obviously the question of whether one can really know what's happening inside North Korea due to the isolated nature of the country, and as you mentioned, even more so due to the pandemic. And researchers such as myself are obviously unable to do any field work. I mean, Jean is one of the few lucky people in the world who was able to spend some time in North Korea for more than just a short trip. But despite these difficulties, there's actually a lot more information than one would think on North Korea. There's certainly, so in writing the book, there's always outlets that you turn to, sources like NK News, NK Daily, 38 North. There's a lot of websites or news sites that are rich with information about North Korean politics, markets, and current events. So researchers have that to go on. But of course, a lot of researchers rely on the next best thing to being able to interview or do research inside North Korea, and that's talk to North Korean defectors. And I know there's a whole debate about whether, with that methodology, and whether defectors provide reliable information. There's a new piece that was out by Jae Song about looking at methods in North Korea. But I do think though that there's what is it now 35,000 defectors in Seoul, and most of them come from the border provinces, the majority are women, so they're not a representative sample, but they do. That doesn't mean that they don't offer insights into North Korea based on their experience. So I did rely on surveys that I didn't conduct, but there was one in particular that was very good. The Institute for Peace and Unification Studies at Seoul National University did conduct an annual survey on defectors, and they always, since I want to say 2010 or 2011, they've been interviewing recent defectors, those that have come to South Korea within the last 12 months. And so it's one of the few sources that offer longitudinal data on insights from North Koreans. And so there were some questions in there about that approximated questions about legitimacy. There was questions about attitudes towards Kim Jong Un, or what they felt about Juche ideology, and about their participation in markets. So I drew on that survey data. I interviewed a few defectors, but they weren't really systematic, so I can't really say that was a main source for my own book. But one thing I did that I felt like hasn't been really done is relying on what I refer to as field worker accounts. So I think there's zero humanitarian workers, or at least zero Western humanitarian workers in North Korea right now. But there are these experts. I would refer to them as experts because they've either also lived in North Korea for some time, or they frequently go in and out, multiple trips per year to have some insights about their interactions with North Koreans, their observations about how markets work. And these field workers, are in the humanitarian sector. Some of them have businesses. Some of them are, work for international organizations like the UNDP. And so I did interview a good number of these field workers to get their insights. And by triangulating from these different sources, I think I had enough information to at least make certain claims, at least hypotheses about, to what extent, this question about what extent change is happening within North Korea. So it is possible. You have to draw on different sources. I know you yourself, Sheena, and Jean also. I don't know if we have time to talk about the tricks of the trade in your case, but there are ways to go about studying North Korea, even though we can't go inside the country.
Well, maybe we can circle back to that in a few minutes. We've got quite a list of questions here, so I want to try to get through at least a few of those, and then yes, I'd love to circle back to that. So I wanted to ask a question that has occurred in a couple of different forms from different audience members. And one is about what the North Korean authorities are doing in the face of marketization, right? And so the question is about, do North Korean authorities think that it's possible to sustain market activity and their political regime at the same time by essentially imitating the Chinese model, or a model maybe that other authoritarian regimes have used that maintains political control, but keeps markets open either domestically, right, for internal trading and market practices within the country, or with some controlled level of international exchange. Andrew, you know that I have a sort of hypothesis about North Korea sort of trying for market Leninism, or the kind of party state capitalism, the fusion that we're seeing, even that Xi Jinping has tried to pursue, where there's a simultaneous need to keep capitalism alive, but really marry it with this very strong Leninist system of party state political control. But I'm curious about your take on this. Where do you think the North Korean regime is comfortable coming down? Where's its limit in terms of market activity?
Yeah, that's really, and that goes back to Jean's question as well. Where is the sweet spot for North Korea? And a lot of, when that question is posed, a lot of people try to look at other models. Does China provide a proper model for North Korea? Can North Koreans, do what the Chinese have done, or is Vietnam a good model? Or what about the Eastern European countries may not be a good model because they've all collapsed, the communist regimes there. I just want to mention one anecdote, and this gets back to Gene. There's a year at the Wilson, when Gene was at the Wilson Center, when Kevin Gray and um, who else was there that year? But I remember having this conversation about, whether how is North Korea going to respond to these changes, and is there the Eastern European model versus the Chinese model? And I was going more the route of the Eastern European model, but over time, I feel like there is a path for North Korea, for Kim Jong Un, and that the country can't just persist. It's barely hanging on right now, especially because of the pandemic. But in order for it to grow economically, it's going to have to rely on markets. But in order to grow the markets, you're going to have to eventually open the country to foreign trade and investment, which inevitably brings more outside information into the country. And right now, what I think is that Kim Jong Un may have felt that it's become too destabilizing for the regime. But that's why I was saying that for the regime, I think if it's able to open up the country and expand markets, but somehow take claims or take the credit for that by bringing markets or mentioning markets as part of the regime's overall ideology, I think it may be able to make that transition. China and North Korea are in a very different spot. China was much more internationalized than North Korea by the time Deng Xiaoping adopted reforms in 1978, and I think that's why North Koreans are more reluctant. And I feel like I'm giving advice, as a consultant to the North Korean regime of how to open your markets without, having your regime crumble or collapse. But I do think somehow they have to take markets for it. The Chinese, what they did was they made entrepreneurs or the capitalists, they were another pillar to the regime, that they were seen as, at first they were shunned, but then they were seen as elevated, as being instrumental to the growth of the CCP. And if there's a way for Kim Jong Un to be able to do that, to try to capture the capitalists or the donjus, he may be able to. That may be the path for him, and being able to sustain his regime while also bringing on these economic reforms.
If I can just jump in and make a point. Yeah, I do think that the North Koreans do pay close attention to how other countries around them, communist countries as well, have made this shift, and they don't look at China. They think China has lost control, that it's too permissive in many ways. And so I don't think they see a good model or a good example out there. I think when Kim Jong Un went to Singapore, it was very intriguing. What would he take from the Singaporean example that might serve as a good model? So I think they're sort of looking to see how other communist countries, or I should say how some communist countries and other sort of more open countries with more open economic markets are handling this, but they don't see good model. I think one thing that might be interesting and intriguing to look at, and Andrew, I believe you touch on this as well, is how do special economic zones fit into how they create a space to explore new ideas, new economic ideas, without having it influence or taint the general population. So in a controlled environment, and that's in some ways what the Kaesong zone was this place where they could experiment and take advantage of the exposure to South Korean industry without having it affect a broader population. So I think that that's an intriguing, perhaps, area to look at to see if they will try to create these special economic zones where they can control the influence. I mean, this idea during the Trump years that they were going to allow Americans to come in and just open up McDonald's. I mean, I think those of us who know North Korea know that they want the money, but not the influence, not that foreign influence. And so it didn't seem at all like a realistic vision for how they were going to get money into North Korea. But I think special economic zones may be an intriguing way for them to control that influence while getting some of the economic experience that they need.
Yeah. And just to interject on that point, we do remember that Kim Jong Un, in addition to the Kaesong, tried to open, I think, 13 other special economic zones. I remember this report from our friend Andre Abramian about the ABCs of SEZs, and I don't know where that went, but that was one approach that Kim Jong Un was trying to do. And on the China model, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I had suggested that there may be a way following China's path, but Kim Jong Un has been resistant. I think the Chinese for years have been trying to show or demonstrate that this may be one way of moving forward. But yes, Kim Jong Un has not really followed that approach.
This is such an interesting question because this seems to be something that single party authoritarian regimes have struggled with throughout history, right? So North Korean state rhetoric has explicitly said we're trying to avoid the fate of Eastern Europe. That model clearly they've deemed a failure. They don't like to sort of rely on or follow China. It's been striking in the past year how willing North Korea was internally to completely crater what is often described as an economic lifeline, which is trade with China, in order to secure the border. And we've seen that Xi Jinping, right, has rolled back some of the economic freedom that capitalism has had and large firms have had in particular sectors in China, right? The original market Leninism actually failed in part because of the concern about the sort of Soviet corollary to the Donju and the political power that they accumulated in the 1920s when Lenin decided that they were going to try market Leninism. So this is just a perennial problem that North Korea is grappling with. And I don't think we should be surprised that they haven't figured out a stable equilibrium as a solution yet. But it's really, that's why this is such an interesting question. And we all, spend a lot of time thinking and debating it. Andrew, I wanted to ask you a question that has come up from the audience about an actor we haven't said a whole lot about yet, and that is the ROK. So what do these changes mean to South Korea, to inter-Korean relations, and to the prospects of unification?
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about changes, I mean, because of the past 2 years, because of the pandemic, we haven't seen much change. That's brought, it's been very difficult for South Korea to do anything. They've tried to make light of trying to offer humanitarian assistance. They've offered, the Moon government has offered lots of things, but North Koreans have really not taken the mantle up on any of these. But if we were to assume that change were to be taking place, if whether in the pre-pandemic era, let's think about a post-pandemic scenario. If markets begin to flourish again, and if we see the balance between, we see a shift towards the role of society and state-society relations in North Korea. I mean, there could be different responses from South Korean government as well as South Korean civil society to engage North Korea. And the current government was, as I mentioned, keen on building things like inter-Korea railway or restarting the Kaesong industrial complex. And so that's something that they may try to do. They may try to engage North Koreans on that front, thinking that North Korea wants to get back into pursuing market activity. But on the other hand, there are also NGOs, I think, that might try to promote or advance programs that try to bring in more information into North Korea. These are mainly human rights organizations. They may see that, oh, well, we see that change is happening on North Korea, so we should capitalize on that. And in this case, they might see that, oh, well, this is now the opportunity to try to challenge the government by letting North Koreans know what the government has been telling them all along is are lies, and are there ways where we can get North Koreans to resist the regime? Because if markets are growing, then there's going to be demand for more information, or more information from the outside world is going to have to enter North Korea. And on questions of things like unification, it's really, I mean, we might take marketization and shifts in state-society relations as a positive direction for unification efforts. That maybe if the North Korean economy improves, that you might begin having conversations about unification, because right now Koreans are very reluctant. If you look at opinion polls, there's surprisingly, North Korean or South Koreans don't want unification right away, and part of it has to do with the cost. But if markets are flourishing and the economy is doing better, there might be conversations about unification again. But of course, shifting state-society relations is no panacea for unification, and there's going to be many other steps and variables that have to also come into play to make that happen.
Thanks. Jean, did you want to add anything, or?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, the longer the two Koreas are divided, and the more that gap between their economies, it's not just that, the economic gap is immense, but also the longer that period grows, it's also a social, cultural, young North Koreans, and I say this from my experience there, young North Koreans and young South Koreans are so vastly different. I can't tell you how different this is by generation. So people of my grandparents' generation, they knew Korea when it was one country, and they are very similar in how they speak, how they think, their mores. But with each successive generation, they are just so different. I can barely understand. When I met with Kim Jong Un, for example, he sounded just like my grandparents, the way he spoke. I could understand him perfectly. He was at the time the president of the Presidium of their Supreme People's Assembly. But when I met with my staff, some of whom were 22, 23-year-olds, it was very hard to understand what they were saying, because their Korean was just completely different. The way that they relate to the world and to Koreans was different. And I would say that's true of South Koreans. There's a huge difference between how young 20-year-old South Koreans speak and their grandparents. And so it's harder for me to imagine. The only unification I can imagine is a kind of economic unification. And Andrew, you're alluding to this in some ways. I think it would take many, many years of South Korea investing in North Korea's economy to really get to a point where they can have an economic unification. But it's very hard for me to really envision any kind of unification beyond that. And I think the younger generation in South Korea doesn't want it. So the longer it goes, the less likely it seems to me as to be something that the South Koreans will want. Of course, it's a completely different question if it's something that happens because of regime collapse or some other societal collapse.
That's really interesting. Okay, I'm just looking through our audience questions here to make sure that we try to cover a few more in the time that we have. A question here that I know both of you have thought a bit about, which is about the influx of illicit funds into North Korea. And so one of the questions says, how do you see the influx of illicit funds through state-sponsored hacking programs supplementing North Korea's capacity for regime control? Do you think these funds play any significant role in their economy? And maybe if I could broaden that, how do these fit in North Korea's, sort of overall attempts to earn revenue through external economic activities, illicit or otherwise? So Andrew, over to you,
Sure.
and then Jean, I know
Sure.
you've thought a bit about this as well.
Yeah, so awesome. Illicit funds, favorite conversation topic. And I know
You
Jean,
know I
and
had
also
to
you,
ask,
Sheena.
Andrew. You know I had to ask.
Jean, and I know you, Sheena, also can weigh in on this. So I'll be fairly brief, but yes, illicit funds are important, whether for North Korea, whether obtained through hacking or the illicit sales of trade of narcotics, arms, other sanctioned materials. And these funds are allegedly used to pay state coffers and keep cash circulating among Kim Jong Un's inner circle, ensuring that those closest to the regime are kept satisfied. I mean, the political science term is the selectorate. And so this is an important way for the regime to raise revenue. And right now, maybe one of the only ways because of the strict border lockdowns. So Yeah, so I'll stop there, but I would love to hear Jean's take on it, since a lot of her podcast on the Lazarus heist touches on issues of hacking and illicit, a lot of other illicit activities.
Yeah, I will. Sheena, you are the expert on the history of how the North Koreans have used illicit funding. So all of you, I recommend that you look at her work on this, because it was seminal, I think, in helping us. Although, I have to say it made it very difficult for me at the time, because your report came out when I was in North Korea. And so this kind of thing is so important for those of us who are there to understand. North Koreans themselves don't quite understand how this works. But those of us who are inside North Korea see things, and we try to connect the dots. And what I'll say is that what I saw on the ground in North Korea was this incredible investment by Kim Jong Un in not only investment in building the loyalty of his generation, the next generation, so the millennials of North Korea. And I thought it was a brilliant strategy for him. I hate to give him credit, but to use science and technology as a way to build loyalty, because he knows, because he's a millennial himself, he knows, just like Mark Zuckerberg knows, that the challenge is to try to find a way to engage that younger generation, and that science and technology is one way to do that. Now, I was seeing all of this unfold on the ground, and I thought, this is on one hand brilliant, because could computers, if they connect to the internet, open up the avenues to information for North Koreans? Or is there another side of this, that a nefarious side to all this development that we need to pay attention to? And that's what I explore in the Lazarus heist, is trying to connect the dots between how Kim Jong Un uses science and technology both to advance the economy, but also to build loyalty among that next generation, but perhaps also create this cyber army of hackers who are then sent overseas to bring in money that can perhaps get around the sanctions. And the concern, of course, that I have is that it's so hard for us to grasp. It's so hard for us to see how cyber works. It's hard to chase it. It's hard to trace it. Where is that money going? Does it mean that it threatens the effectiveness of diplomacy and sanctions? And I think these are all things that we need to look at. So, I hope that you have a chance to listen to the podcast, but also give me some feedback on where we should be going with this investigation, because it does also look at the overseas network and how that is a part of how over the decades they have brought in illicit funding. And again, I think that, Sheena, you are the expert on this topic. So I encourage everyone to read the work that you've done. And Andrew, I think you touch on these things as well, is in your book, is how do we need to take that into account when we look at the roles that all of these outside influences play on the relationship between society and state?
It's a fascinating question. And Jean, a lot of the activity that I looked at was not in the cyber realm. In fact, at one point in 2012, I remember thinking that was the likely direction North Korea would go. And indeed, we have seen, especially as the country has been physically isolated and its people have been isolated with sanctions and now the pandemic, that cyber activity is a way of externally engaging without physically leaving the country. And that's really important for maintaining the form of isolation that North Korea has pursued. But we also know that when a regime can get money at the top and then distribute it downward in authoritarian patronage, that can actually be conducive to regime stability. So it'll be really interesting to see how North Korea's types of engagement in this activity unfolds, because I do think it's likely to have real consequences for the state-society balance that Andrew's work really interrogates. Okay, we are coming up on the end. So as a final question, I wanted to ask both of you to engage in a little bit of informed prediction. So one of the, this is based on an audience question again, but also just to sort of tell us where you think North Korea is likely to go. So if the Donju class that Andrew has written about these market activities are, powerful and influential on a grassroots and on the ground level, to what extent is Kim Jong Un likely to feel threatened enough that we'll actually see further crackdowns? Or do you anticipate that there'll be some, further entrenchment of market activity and even possible, limits on state control? So in a nutshell, where do you each see this headed in the next maybe 5 or so years?
Thanks, Sheena. Political scientists are not the greatest when it comes to predictions, but if we look at past attempts at trying to rein in markets, at the end, markets always have seemed to prevail. And I think we're just in this unique situation because of the pandemic. But outside of this pandemic, this very strict border lockdown that's going now for close to 2 years, I do think that's going to be difficult to sustain this kind of clamp down on markets. I think there is going to be some pushback, or the regime is going to have to relent. So it's if you're looking at this purely from an economic or markets perspective, it's like a 2-step forward, 1 step back type process. Because even if you look from 2000 to 2010, and then 2010 to let's say 2016, there has been growth in the market trends. But I think they were coming up to a point where at some point you need to have foreign investment and more trade and creditors for the markets to actually grow. And I think that's the point that North Korea was at. But then Kim Jong Un, as we mentioned earlier, didn't feel things were looking unsettling to him, and so he had, because of sanctions and because of the border, the pandemic, we don't know how this would have played out. But because I think that the markets will, in the long run, ultimately prevail, I do think we're going to see more changes taking place. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to see democratization, or we're going to see a revolution, or regime collapse. I think the safer route is we may see something like a Vietnam or a China, even if that's not where Kim Jong Un wants to go. But I do think that that's the direction that we may be heading 5 years, 10 years out from now.
Jean, any prediction?
So what I'll say is that if I were in North Korea now, I think I can extrapolate, and I imagine that what's happening right now is that everything is geared toward the lionization of Kim Jong Un as he approaches his 10-year anniversary. And this is a series of events that's going to extend into next year. And I do think that part of the border closures and the kind of trying to wrest control over market activity is partly to be able to control and shape the messaging and the mythology around Kim Jong Un. And perhaps after they feel secure, that he feels secure that he's established his legitimacy as part of these 10-year anniversaries, that they may start to open up again. And so it just depends on when the timing is right, given the celebrations, the anniversaries that they have lined up as part of their propaganda. This is important for his legacy, for his historical legacy, for his leadership. And so it's a very simple thing, but so for me, when I'm on the ground, I always look at what's in the North Korean calendar. What does he have to protect? And I think that's a big part of it. And that perhaps, hopefully, fingers crossed, that once he feels comfortable with that process, that they'll start to open up the borders and open up the markets again, and let the economy start to flourish, and let those people who, the traders, the people in those markets, do the kind of resilient and resourceful work that they do to get goods into the country.
Well, I hope that optimistic scenario, or that optimistic possibility, is something that we see some version of coming through. I'll confess to a little bit of cynicism as a longtime North Korea watcher about optimistic outcomes on the Korean Peninsula. With that, I think it falls to me just to thank the audience for a terrific set of questions and for being so engaged throughout this webinar. Thank you, Jean, for your comments. Thank you to the Brookings Institution, the Center for East Asia Policy, to Adrian for organizing the logistics of this. And finally, thank you to Andrew for having written a terrific and insightful book that gave us so much to talk about today. We clearly could have kept going with the questions and discussion for a while. And And I think that's just a testament to the quality and the relevance of the work that you've produced and brought to all of us today. So thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. Take care.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.